Good morning, everyone. If you could take your seats, we will begin promptly. Thank you so much for spending your Friday morning with us and being here so early. You know, people are talking about the rain, but if you want to see rain, you need to be in England. This is a drizzle. Well, we have this morning and yesterday is a drizzle. This is not rain. But it's so good of you to make the time to be here. As you know, we have been working with Ad Astra over the last couple of months to talk about how we can improve our scheduling process as we move from individual campuses doing scheduling to a college-wide perspective with our course scheduling. They also have another component which they call their analytics, which goes in and looks at our scheduling pattern, gives us an idea of where our hotspots occur and our off-grid waste. Patrick Kane this morning is visiting us from Ad Astra. He flew in from Denver, and he's going to talk to us about the analytical part of Ad Astra. They looked at our data from fall 2018 regarding our scheduling pattern, and they have some information to share with us regarding that, and hopefully some suggestion as to how we can improve that process of our scheduling approach to the courses. So I'm not going to take up any more time. I'm going to turn the mic over to Patrick Kane, and he will talk in depth with you as much as we can this morning about Ad Astra and what they have discovered. And then there'll be time for a Q&A afterwards. Patrick.
Thank you, Lamada. So, Marcos, I can hear myself. If I were to stand in front of both, is that like a... That's fine. Oh, is that okay? Okay, good. So, good morning, all. Patrick Kane, strategic consultant from Ad Astra Information Systems. Greatly appreciate your time on a Friday morning, especially after having heard that I'm competing with the governor. So even more honored that you would spend your time with me and learning about Ad Astra, given who's in town. As Lamada had shared, we are really excited to be embarking on a partnership with you all to help you better understand some of the challenges from a scheduling perspective potentially faced by Pima Community College students, and how we might work together to optimize processes such that your lives as educators, administrators, schedulers can become easier, hopefully more informed, and of course the bigger picture item that your students can have a more successful experience when it comes to getting the courses they need when they need them in order to really speed up their time to graduation. The velocity piece in this has really become a core tenet of our philosophy at Ad Astra. How can we help students graduate faster? And so with that in mind, I do have a good deal of data. You know, as much as you're able to stomach this morning, I can certainly go in depth, as Lamada had said, with all of this information, knowing full well that we're looking forward to the longevity of this partnership. There might be a lot to digest in one fell swoop when it comes to really kind of understanding this data, the source of this data out of the gate, and know full well that we're really looking forward to continuing to integrate on many levels. Technologically, as we integrate with your degree audit system. Certainly we're already integrated with your student information system, but really sort of integrate with your processes. Understand what currently works, where you're currently struggling. We have seen greatest success in these projects when they're tailored to the needs of our clients. So I don't want, if any of you, and I hope there are few, if no one in the room thinking that Ad Astra is here to you know, create a whole new process for you all. That is not the case. We are here to help inform that process and really work with you to better understand your own current processes so as to improve those over time. And so with that, I really embark on this with a sense of partnership, and a special thanks to LaMotta and Ivy and their team for orchestrating this initial kickoff event, but certainly working with us to get the data that we're about to share in the state that it's in, knowing full well that it's the current state. And there are absolutely further opportunities to configure this information and to account for specialized situations and to make sure we're only pointed to those areas that represent feasible opportunities for you all. And that's where context meets data, right? I'm going to be honest with you. Through the course of the next couple of hours, I'm going to share with you data, and it might come across as blunt. I might say something bluntly. Well, here's what the data says. And you all have context to that data, and we are deeply interested in knowing what that context is. So as much as I try to curb my bluntness, know that should something come across as blunt, it's simply because I'm learning that context, right? And so I encourage you to be vocal in sharing that so that we can really kind of coalesce in that way and create the most productive conversation, right? To be blunt, I don't know, my first blunt statement, I don't know the ins and outs of Pima Community College just yet, right? I'm going to hopefully know more and more over time. But we do have some data that may generate some angles that hadn't been previously considered. So we'll talk through those and all the while work our way toward hopefully a productive collaborative conversation as this partnership really takes shape. Because today I have some data, largely historically based, but this is the beginning of an integration that will, over the course of several different terms, create new data sets representative of new and fluid student bodies that are coming in and need shifting and moving sets of requirements in order to graduate on time. So with that, our data will hopefully represent to a clear extent what those opportunities are so that you can optimize in accordance with those student needs. Questions out of the gate before I sort of jump in here? Okay. Please, I take no offense when somebody, if I don't see a hand, if it's over there and I'm looking over here, throw it out. Patrick, I have a question. There are, and we shifted the times a little bit because of the fact it's Friday. Let's get in, get out, right? So it's more like an 8:30 to 10:30. We're going to look at course and capacity analysis concepts. We're going to talk about what's called a HESI, Higher Education Scheduling Index. We took Pima Community College's data and we put it into our benchmark index in order to provide you with a sense comparatively across the industry as to where you sit with other community colleges in our database, of which we have over or close to 150 at this point, and it's always growing. We're going to take a look at your HESI data in the immediate context, as LaMotta had said, in fall of 2018. And that's going to be really kind of the thrust of this morning's conversation. Like I said, it's a lot of data to take in at one time. We hope that through conversation, context can come into play as well, more and more. And then we also have all of this data sitting in dashboards in a more visible format. So perhaps we can spend a little bit of time maybe walking through some of that and see what that data holds. And then session 2, we're going to be talking a little bit more with a team that we'll be working with regularly to kind of really jumpstart the platinum analytics side of the equation. And really the platinum analytics concepts themselves, we'll actually talk through at a high level this morning because I think it'll be good for you all to know, hey, high level, what are we going to be seeing term over term from Ad Astra within this platinum analytics service? So, goals and objectives. As I mentioned, data works best when met with context, and there's no greater context than the understanding of what are your challenges at Pima Community College. Our data can go any number of hundreds of directions, and if we're not careful, we will go hundreds of directions, and that's not exactly productive. In the end, we want to have a framework through which you all can digest this information and really over time understand where you're making progress. And so improving student access and cultivating institutional excellence through continuous improvement really create for us, from the perspective of what's being done here, or at least advocated at Pima Community College, it gives us the framework to sort of move forward in what we think will be a really sort of productive angle. Improving student access is the core of our value proposition. We hope that that is something that becomes clear even in this conversation, but certainly throughout our partnership. We're going to begin to discuss these goals and what your data holds through looking at fall 2018 data. We captured data as of census, fall 2018. So when we talk about things like course fill rates and how ultimately courses enrolled, those data points are as of census. It is always our practice, if we ever refer to a previous term, to pull that data as of census. And we coordinate with your project managers to make sure we're pulling at the right point in time. And ultimately, what we want to do is help you to see, perhaps if it be a new way of looking at things, understanding where, from a course perspective, changes can be made through what we call candidates. These are section-level opportunities within a course. If a course offering 100 seats has filled consistently 99 to 100 of those seats, it might drum up an addition candidate, in which case, if you had previously offered 4 sections in that course, very simply the recommendation, offer a 5th, offer perhaps a 6th, to accommodate what we would call pent-up demand, right? It's not just enough to in some cases, kind of, be, for lack of a better word, proud of the fact that we're offering and filling 100% of the seats. The real burning question is, should we be offering 150? Are there students that aren't getting this course that should? And what can we do to offer those additional seats? And I understand that might be a loaded question, right? There might be, yes? Oh, please.
1 second. Can we get the mic to you? Because we're this.
Thank you, sir.
I think it's important, is the mic working? Yeah. That our goal is to improve student access and student success. Those two things have to be tied together. It's not just access.
Oh, yeah, very, very good. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I duly noted, absolutely, that student access and then success in those courses is critically important. When it comes to scheduling, I think most of our angle, where Ad Astra is going to fit in, is going to be on the access standpoint. But when we start to take a look at why students aren't succeeding in the aggregate, and this is something that I talked about a little while ago with the project team, when we start to talk about why students aren't succeeding, ultimately we can begin to pinpoint reasons as to that. Perhaps there are fail rates and students. And then the other question is, are students who are failing and then getting into those courses again, doing so to the consequence of students trying to get in the first time? Right? So it's a complex question, but absolutely. Access first, success equally as important. Yes?
Are we looking at student success rates?
Not necessarily. Well, we're going to be looking, success should be unpacked a little bit. We're going to be looking at the rate at which, eventually the rate at which students are matriculating through programs. Yes. So we're going to be able to extract information to suggest that at a rate students are currently progressing, should they continue to progress at that rate, they'd graduate in 3.2 years, say. And if the goal be 2 years, then there's a gap there to address. How to address that gap is a layered question. And from a student access standpoint, if part of the reason they are not getting to graduation on time is because of the inaccess they have to core courses along the way, then that is something we want to help you address through the Ad Astra Platinum Analytics. If they're getting in and, say, failing, then there's only so much that Ad Astra can do in that regard. But what we can do is help you position the conversation appropriately. Right? We can help you unpack this question of success and make sure that you're pivoting interventions in the right way, if that makes sense. Is there another question? Oh, you're going to be our mic runner. Thank you. Okay, so candidates, addition candidates. Conversely, we're offering multiple sections of a course. The course itself isn't filling at a rate that perhaps justifies the volume of sections that are being offered. then the recommendation from a strict data perspective would be perhaps to offer fewer sections. In those cases, those are what we call our candidates. And we'll dig into those, of course, as they relate specifically to PIMA in just a couple of minutes. And then all the while, we're relating your metrics and goals to actuals of peer institutions. What do we want to help you do? Understand course offering warning signals that potentially impact student access to required courses and graduation. So this gets to a core tenet of that success, right? Why are students not graduating on time? Well, part of the challenge could be that students aren't getting the courses they need on time. So we really want to help you hone in on that challenge, and then where necessary, be able to know when to pivot. This isn't a course access issue. This may be a course a student success issue in the classroom. And we want to be able to tilt resources the appropriate direction. Inefficiencies that directly impact capacity and budgets. So where are the situations where you're offering 4 sections, perhaps you only need to offer 2? What are some financial impacts of those situations when aggregated up across a curriculum? Or perhaps more fundamentally, what is the consequence of offering that potentially unneeded 4th section at a point in time when you could be offering a section that is needed by a student, right? So really understanding the trade-offs and the consequences of the interrelationships of all of your courses within a schedule, right? And then doing so, of course, within the framework that we want to continue to work through with your school community, right? We want to make sure that we're targeting all of these conversations in direct association with your own goals at PIMA. Excuse me. This slide here generally recognizes that scheduling is complex, right? I think you all could attest to this perhaps even more than I can, having to do this multiple times throughout a year. There are so many variables associated to putting together the schedule. There is perhaps no single element operationally on a campus more significant than scheduling. You've got faculty resources and faculty availability and human resources to consider. You've got actual brick and mortar buildings to consider and the cost of running operations in these buildings. You've got students, obviously, who need to graduate on time, who are seeking to get the courses they need. You have graduation goals that you're trying to attain. And then finally, all of this wrapped into a finite window of time. When you talk about on-ground sections, how do we account for all of this at a point in time that does create a sense of availability for all? And then, all the while, throw in the fact that web-based programming is really starting to proliferate across the industry. And I can tell you, institution by institution, as we talk with schools, that's a good thing, but it also can be a challenging thing, right? We've had some schools flatly ask, are we an institution to be offering 40% of our courses online, 30% of our courses online, right? Or are the online offerings, which typically do fill pretty well, do they fill because of the fact that students otherwise have a hard time getting on-ground courses? Are they opting to go online because that's an easier way to get the 12 or 15 credit hours they need? And what does that do, speaking of the success question, how do students succeed in these areas? How do students succeed online? And should we be doing perhaps a better job of ensuring their on-ground access if that's what ultimately maybe first they desire, but really they may need, right? So all of these complexities obviously make scheduling a difficult task, but none more critical, I think, perhaps a variable in this whole process than the students themselves. And the reason that we do what we do and the reason that we highlight what we highlight is to improve student outcomes and velocity to graduation. And it just so happens we work with Ruffalo Noel Levitz. I don't know if anyone in the room is familiar with Ruffalo Noel Levitz. They're an enrollment management firm. Actually, they've got an office in Denver, but we partner with them on this survey every year because of its direct relevance to what we do. Up to 50% of students, as you can see in that second bullet, are not satisfied with class registration. And of all of the reasons they could not be satisfied with class registration, the number one reported challenge, perennially, is course access. I just simply couldn't get the courses I needed. And again, to the point I made earlier, what does that do for their time to graduation? where in situations would they have opted to take what we would term productive course, meaning the course directly related to their degree pursuit, but because of its unavailability, and maybe because of financial aid considerations or something else, they decide, all right, well, I guess I'll take this course. And unbeknownst to them, that course may not be productive, right? So they may just be accumulating credits for the sake of accumulating credits, and next thing you know, you've got a student who's 90 credits in and has yet to attain a degree or certificate from the school. Right? So we want to alert you to these situations in the moment. We want to help you understand the students who are currently facing these situations so as to help to steer them appropriately within the schedule. And you're starting to think, wait a second, this is tilting a little toward advising, isn't it? I mean, this isn't just a scheduling situation at this point. And really, the broader work that we're doing is highlighting a student ecosystem that you just can't ignore all of these tenets, right? The student success piece in the classroom, the advising, the fact that students aren't maybe declaring at a point in time they should declare a major, and what does that mean for their productive credit hour load out of the gate, how all of this relates to the schedule. So we're doing a better and better job within our Platinum Analytics software of accounting for that ecosystem. I'll share with you a little bit how throughout this presentation here today. So our approach is really to initially benchmark and implement for you all within a framework established actionable metrics to inform schedule planning. How do we really tilt a conversation and galvanize the campus behind addressing overloaded courses? Understanding if 25% of our curriculum is overloaded, what does that mean for our students and how can we address that? How do we build balance and what does that look like and how do we measure it? And through that we can set priorities, as I mentioned, and all the while aligning resources to student need, right? All of this is meant to really drive some of that resourcing conversation. If you're like any of the community colleges we've worked with, you're dealing with a finite resource pool, right? Nobody's got, nobody's wallpapering their walls with money that I've encountered. And so the truth is you've got to work within a finite pool, and how best can you do that? And then finally, how do we know we're making progress? How can we point to this approach of strategic scheduling and say, due to a conscientious decision to focus on X, we've seen improvements here and here in student outcomes? Well, that's where longitudinal tracking comes in, right? If we're going to build a framework and hold ourselves accountable to the framework, then ultimately we want to know that it leads to measurable student outcomes, and what does that look like over time? So this Ad Astra approach, we're going to be just kind of dipping our toe in the water here this morning. There's a lot of data to ingest and a lot of conversation to have, but ultimately our intent is to really build a conscientious approach to this whole process, and that's going to happen throughout the length of our partnership. Okay, I'm about to get to some key terms as we start talking about this initial data pull that we've done to give you a high-level understanding of your data via fall 2018 information. But any questions thus far? Is making sense? Concerns, anything? Yes, sir. Geography was the question. Geography in terms of your multiple campuses?
And the distance between them?
And the distance between them, absolutely. So the way that our analytics works is we associate every course to its given campus, of course, as imported. And then ultimately what we will do is associate students to a campus as well. And not to get too into the weeds technologically, but ultimately we assign a student to the campus into which he or she has taken the majority of their classes. And so the demand that you see for a given course should be reflective of the students associated to that campus by the way that I described. So it does become sort of a question of, okay, and I need to know a little bit more as I learn about all of the different campuses that you have and sort of the percentage breakdown perhaps of courses offered on those campuses. But that's essentially how the analytics attaches demand to a campus. Does that make sense? From there, it's definitely a question of, how do we address these resourcing challenges, and hopefully we can help inform that conversation.
And are the online enrollments considered a campus in your system, or how does that work?
Great question. The online campus is, so essentially the extent to which we account for a campus is the extent to which you account for a campus. So I would have to know, are online courses rolled up to the main campus? That we see that a lot, or?
Currently, they happen in different ways, honestly.
Okay. Okay.
Some are attached to a campus, community campus. Others are scheduled by individual campuses because they don't fall under the primary distance ed division.
Sure.
So it's a bit complicated.
Yeah. Well, we'd have to unpack that. Ultimately, what we do is we have some clients, although I'll say honestly we have a few clients, not many, who have a separate online campus, in which case it would work the very same way I described previously. We attach students to that online campus if that's where they've taken the majority of their courses. Absent that specific campus, then what probably 90% of the remaining clients do is they roll their online offerings up to like a main campus. And then what we do is you have to work through the application to see, we roll up demand for a course. Let's say you offer 6 sections and 150 seats. We roll up demand to, or 180 seats. Let's make my math simple. We then roll up and if 4 of those sections are offered on the main campus and 2 of them are online, we're going to show demand for that entire lump. And then what a lot of clients have done is, okay, if the demand shows that we are offering 160 seats, but maybe we should be offering 200, then we take a look at those underlying section fill rates and determine, well, online fill rates have actually been higher than on-ground fill rates. And so if we're going to add a section, why don't we be strategic about it and add it online? Could be one thought. Or a better way to unpack it would be all of our on-ground sections are offered between 10 and 2, and so therefore perhaps we should be offering another on-ground section from 3 to 5 somewhere and provide students an opportunity to take it in the afternoon, right? So it's just a question of kind of unpacking that information if that online association is rolled up. Great question. Any others? We're going to get to some of these questions and approaches to the technology as we work our way through. So, as I mentioned, and I apologize, yellow, I should tell our marketing folks, yellow's hard to read. The Higher Education Scheduling Index. So as I mentioned previously, the metrics that we're about to walk through are compared against a peer database. And that peer database is what we collectively call our Higher Education Scheduling Index, or our HESI. And this database, as you can see, is comprised of close to 300 institutions, almost 140 of which are community colleges. So as we take a look at your data and we tell you that your fill rate is X and that puts you in the nth percentile, well, that percentile is a measure of what have we seen in the other close to 140 community colleges we've measured, right? So as we work our way through this, do so with an understanding that the measurement is benchmarked against those schools. Okay? And in fact, I'm just reminding myself now, we've just recently come out with a white paper that puts even more into context these metrics that I'm about to talk through, and really associates things like enrollment ratio, as we'll talk through, to retention. We have an associate vice president of research and statistics that has spent a career studying higher education statistics, and he's put together this white paper for us. So Lamont, I'm going to get that to you as a follow-up to this conversation so that you can have even further kind of context into where this data is coming from. Yes, ma'am.
Could you read the white that's on the yellow?
Absolutely. And like I said, I got to talk to our marketing folks. It says community college, 138, so there are 138 schools in our database. And then four-year publics, we have 111. Gosh, I can't even read it, and I'm right here. So, and then obviously we've got to work on our four-year private index, but it's okay. So, the metrics themselves. What are we going to begin? How are we going to begin to offer a collective understanding of your schedule? We'll start on the course side. And the most fundamental metric that we work with is something we call an enrollment ratio. And the enrollment ratio is very simply an average, think of it as an average fill rate, where it's the average course enrollment over the average course capacity. It is census data. When we look at it, we're looking at fill rates as of census. And because it always comes up and it's critical to talk through, for our purposes in this type of analysis, but we would argue more broadly, generally speaking, the course cap matters. It does matter. And so for some campuses, and I'll say this as we look at your data for the first time, for some campuses, actually I'd say probably the majority, where we first kick off this conversation, the next step for so many campuses is to think through that course cap. Are we intentional with our course cap? And I'm saying this, by the way, not having any context into your course cap policies right now or how they're set at Pima Community College. But for us, that course cap certainly matters. If you want a foundational strategic understanding of fill rates at your institution, it starts certainly with a foundational course cap. So once we have an average fill rate, we then categorize these courses into one of three directions. A course can be, based upon our analysis, termed overloaded, balanced, or what we collectively call underutilized. And an overloaded course is a course filling to 95+% of its cap. A balanced course is a course filling between 70 and 95% of its cap, and an underutilized course is a course filling less than 70% of its cap. And this is to provide, as best as we can, an initial framework for understanding course offerings at an institution, to provide some directional thinking. Course by course, is there context? Absolutely. I'll give you one out of the gate. A nursing course. You offer 25 seats, you fill 25 seats, and we term it overloaded. All it would take, perhaps, is somebody within the nursing program 2 seconds to say, wait, that's a cohorted course. I know those students. That's the way the course is designed. Very good. Then that's exactly where context meets data, right? And so we need to make sure that we can understand what this data is trying to put out versus, the underlying context that needs to come into play. Nursing probably isn't a great example for this next point, but we do have within the analysis, and I'll share with you in just a second, the opportunity to exclude courses that are irrelevant to this type of analysis, right? Just because of their very structure and nature. We certainly wouldn't argue being freewheeling with the idea of a course exclusion, but ultimately we want to focus in on the courses that are going to be most actionable, right, in this sort of a framework. Yes, sir?
Are your course caps set by the reality of what that course cap must be, or is it a financial model? Yep. Are the course caps set by the reality of what that course happens to be, because we have certain requirements that set cap? Or is it a financial cap that is sort of a generic thing that we use as an institution?
We imported the caps from your student information system. So I don't know if that's it's just a question of how you set your caps.
It can be set.
It can be set, absolutely. Yep. The greatest thing, and if they be for the financial reasons you mentioned or pedagogical, first of all, pedagogy is, of course, fundamental to informing a course cap. Secondly, there are two kind of fundamental tenets that we have when it comes to course caps. One is pedagogy, right? Pedagogy's got to drive that course cap conversation first and foremost. And then secondly, does the course cap represent a real and anticipated demand for this course, right? If those two boxes are checked, we've got probably a good course cap to work with. But if we're setting course caps arbitrarily, it's been set at 90 and it's never filled greater than 25% of that cap, well, why is that cap set the way that it is? That's a question, again, worth exploring because of its impact on this whole conversation, not the software, but this whole conversation. So it's certainly something to consider. Yes, ma'am.
So what is the process going to be like to sort of defining these terms? Like who's going to be involved in the conversation? Because, for instance, the issue of enrollment ratio and course caps, some of that is driven by pedagogy, but most of the time, at least in the social sciences where I'm at, it's usually by room capacity. And so in going forward, in terms of defining these terms, it would really be important to have faculty involved in talking about the reality of course caps and where they're driven by pedagogy and where they're not in order to have a more realistic, in this case, enrollment ratio.
Mm-hmm.
That really is an academic affairs conversation. That is not where we would include Ad Astra. So that goes back to academic affairs. You should be having that conversation with the faculty and the deans to determine those definitions.
Mm-hmm.
So that's beyond the scope of Ad Astra. That really is a PIMA, academic affairs conversation.
So I guess my question is, where does that conversation intersect, or when does it happen? When is it going to happen? Because we haven't adjusted capacities, room capacities or course capacity to define them in ways that's going to give you a realistic enrollment ratio.
Really, you should be bringing that up when you have your conversation about building the schedule for your areas. You have that conversation with your deans, because I know there are some deans that I've had that question with, and they've been able to share with me the rationale behind the cap and issues like room capacity. We also need to bring facilities into that conversation, because there are fire code issues that we need to take into consideration with some of our rooms. Some of our rooms are capped because of the fire code, and yet we find that tables and chairs are being moved to push into the rooms to accommodate the overload of the students. So it really is an all-round ongoing conversation. There is no set start time, and there definitely isn't any end time.
Other questions? So a little bit about these categories, if you will. So especially firstly the overloaded course category. Why is it important to highlight the overloaded course category? Well, for reasons that I mentioned earlier, the extent to which it highlights pent-up demand, right? If we've got a large or sizable chunk of the schedule that is filling to 95+% of its cap, unless you all are hyper aware of every single student need and every term, there is a very strong statistical likelihood that that volume of over-enrollment leads to what we call pent-up demand. And the consequence of that pent-up demand is a student unable to healthily matriculate through, right? So we want to really kind of target, in an overloaded situation, the actionable scenarios where it's both feasible and going to be impactful to add sections in courses where demand warrants, right? I'll be honest, when we initially take a look at this data today, we won't have a complete picture of that pent-up demand. We are working right now on configuration items to integrate with the degree audit system and eventually your student academic pathways to get a very in-depth and sophisticated understanding of what we call pent-up demand looks like. As we attach students to their pathways and we try to project them forward on a healthy pattern, who's going to run into these bottlenecks? What is going to be the impact of these bottlenecks? That's where that overloaded course situation really starts to become a powerful one. In the interim, knowing where you have over-enrollment and beginning to talk from a resource perspective about what drives that over-enrollment, the inability to balance supply and demand, is an important one to have, right? Knowing full well there are limitations. Hey, I'd love to add 2 sections. We don't have the lab space. Hey, I'd love to add 3 more faculty members. Where's the financial means to do so? Understandable. This isn't a situation where we can, you can act on every situation, nor would we advocate it. But through continuous iterative, as your first objective here at PIMA had indicated, continual process improvement will allow for you to prioritize situations over time that will allow us to really chip away at this in impactful ways, right? All the while, maybe, and by the way, this has happened, where we begin to develop a statewide case for the fact that, look, students aren't graduating because there aren't enough lab space. We need the funding to get this done, and here's the data to prove it, right? And so where those situations demand the student success data to continue the conversation, those are situations too where we've helped some institutions. Yes?
I have a very quick question.
Yeah.
If I'm the department head and I'm working on the schedule, I will just be able to log into Ad Astra and see this data?
That's right.
Okay, that's all. I just didn't know how the data was going to be handled and how I'd have access to it.
Yep.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Yep. Usernames, passwords, you dig in. And at various points, we'll talk about this, there are points during the year where data is updated. Yeah. And so at key points when you typically plan, we want to make sure that data is refreshed for you. Balance course ratio, between 70 and 95%. Balance for us is, and for some institutions, this is a hard thing to wrap your mind around. So if I fill my course to 90% instead of 98%, you're telling me that's better? And statistically speaking, yes, it is, in most cases. Now, again, are there the one-offs, like a single course in a small program where you know the students? Well, no, not necessarily, right? But in the aggregate, institutionally, striving for balance, we have seen correspond to improved average student credit hours for students. The more a schedule is balanced, meaning the greater percentage of courses offered that fill between 70 and 95%, the better students are able to navigate. The better students are able to move through given your offerings in order to graduate on time. So balance is really, for a lot of our clients, a core area of focus as you think about schedule building term over term. And then finally, the underutilized situations, right? And in those cases, there are, to be blunt, budgetary realities associated with consistent underutilization. I think more importantly, from a student success standpoint, the better question might be, where is our underutilization preventing us from otherwise addressing over-enrollment, right? And so that kind of resourcing is an important yet complex conversation to have, and one that we'd hope to continue to inform along the way. Our target enrollment ratio, by the way, 85%, right in the middle of that balance category. Fill rates at 85%, and by the way, I mentioned this white paper, our Vice President of Research and Statistics has statistically, in looking at all of the data from our community college clients, shown direct proven impact between increased enrollment ratios toward 85% and improved retention. Because if you understand all of the underlying implications of that. So, I mentioned the candidates. First, we get an understanding of your courses, then we take action at the candidate level or the section level. I'm offering 4 sections and 100 seats. The demand shows I need 130 seats. The average section size is 25. The analysis would suggest offer an additional section. Reduction and elimination candidates work the other direction. Reduction candidates, multi-section courses, you're offering 4 sections. We look through demand. By the way, the demand is generated by looking in this analysis that we'll look at today. We look back at how the course filled in fall 18, what we call the baseline term, and then how has the course filled each of the past 5 like terms, what we call the trend. And the combination of data coming from the baseline, last like term, and the trend correspond to, in this what we call historical analysis, a recommendation. Ultimately, when we integrate with the degree audit system and then your student academic pathways, we're going to have more data points to suggest seats needed. And we'll talk through those as that data becomes relevant. Reduction candidates, multi-section courses, the data, based upon our analysis, suggests you are offering 4, maybe you need 2. Consider 2. And so the recommendation would be to trim by 2 sections. By the way, context meets data. If there are situations you're offering 2 sections, we suggest you offer 1. Hold on a second. We have a morning section and we have an evening section. Understood. Then that's context meets data, right? You have to be able to accommodate populations in those cases, right? So you have to take this data for what it is and bring in the context, right? And that's where all of these critical conversations really kind of bring all of that to light. The last candidate, perhaps a hard one to swallow, right? Elimination candidates. Let me just say that we have received more recommendations to change that word than any other suggestion in the entire company's existence. and we're continuing to receive them, and it's continuing to be debated. The immediate thing to bear in mind with an elimination candidate, first, what is it? Typically, we're looking at, in almost all cases, single-section courses that have filled at or less than 50% of their cap. So sincere underutilization. If you remember, the underutilized course begins at 70% and below. This is more sincere underutilization, and it's recurred. It's happened each of the past 3, 4, 5 like terms. In those situations, the recommendation is to remove that course. Now, none of this is a curricular recommendation. It's all a scheduling recommendation with an eye toward the immediate forthcoming term. So the recommendation in the case of an elimination candidate would be to consider not offering that course in fall 2019. A lot of our clients like to think of these on sort of a rotating basis. Maybe we offer them every other term. Is there a need to offer it every like term, right? And especially in cases where you're offering it in the fall and then again in the spring, is there a need for that, right? And so, as you're taking a look at these elimination candidates, know that there's certainly some things to unpack. And by the way, especially when we look at historical data, we ultimately, when connecting with a degree audit and eventually our pathways, will be able to note what's a core course. We might have a sincerely under-enrolled biology course, but that biology course is core to a small cohort of students. Our recommendation is not to remove it, of course, and in the more sophisticated integration, our attempt will be to actually capture that core designation and not even put it on the list at all, despite maybe under-enrollment. When you're looking at this data, strict historical data, think of it as kind of a potential elimination situation, and there'll be a list that you would want to comb through and understand what makes sense given the context, what doesn't, right? And by the way, not to say if it doesn't make sense because of its context, is there another conversation to have, right? If it's sincerely under-enrolled and it's offered at 11 a.m. during peak student availability time and that's taking up a room, maybe there is a conversation to have, not necessarily to remove the course, but to understand the implication of that low enrollment in the whole ecosystem, right? So again, these are ways to kind of tee up these conversations, and I'll be here, I'll be working with a strategic team on a regular basis to kind of, surface up these questions and understand various ways other clients have really kind of leveraged these conversations productively. Questions on any of this? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my question is, what schools are using Ad Astra who have the same tools we have, like Banner 9 and DegreeWorks? And it also seems that some of this is, the way the tool's going to be most efficient is if all of our students have planners.
Sure.
And all of our students, and we have all that data uploaded up front, which of course we're in the process of doing with Pathways. So that's why I was curious which schools we could talk to on the academic advising side of things.
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is Banner, DegreeWorks schools, a lot. That's probably, if I were to venture a guess, 35% of our client pool is Banner, DegreeWorks. So there are a lot. Not as many Banner 9, right? Some are kind of working their way up. As I know, your DegreeWorks is being upgraded too, so that is to come. But I can absolutely, as a follow-up, I'll generate a list. We've got community colleges, Banner, DegreeWorks that themselves are implementing planners and pathways, so you can certainly have those conversations. I can tell you the idea of integrating with pathways, it's a complex one, and one that our developers have accounted for in multiple different ways where, ultimately, where's the best way to get data on what students want to take and are going to take? Well, it's when students tell you, hey, I'm going to take this and let's move it over. Boom, one-to-one. Absent that, because of student adoption rates in a pathway or students only completing maybe half of a term or something like that and then walking away, we import the templates and attach the students based on their declared major to that template and kind of plan for them, right? It's not a perfect model, but it's a great way to see not only how you can accommodate the demand so that a student may go back and be like, oh, great, I'm glad this course is available because this was a course I needed, and two, how are students progressing against those pathways, period, right? That's that velocity piece. So a lot more on that, but I'll certainly get you a list. I'm going to make a note of that to get you a list of banner degree work schools who are looking to implement pathways. Community colleges, I'm sure you're interested in, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so I mentioned exclusions. We took an initial pass, and this is not to undermine the work done to go through this data. I would, if it's anything like any other on-site I've been to, we've got a good first pass at this data. We're going to continue to comb through it and figure out one-off course situations. But as we take a look at your data, know that courses that you see here, these math courses, course numbers that you see here, and subject areas were all not included in this analysis. So any of the numbers you see will not have incorporated these courses, course numbers, and subjects. Like I said, this may not represent the whole list. Configuration is an ongoing conversation. It evolves for most of our clients, but it's a good first step. So, what do we note? First and foremost, let's take a look at your average enrollments in the average enrollment cap in fall of 2018. You can see, on average, the enrollment in Pima Community College courses was 19 over a cap of 24. That, in fact, puts you just, if we skip ahead, the mean here, by the way, we're starting to look at that HESI database. The mean here is the whole database, 290 almost schools. Community colleges are probably where you're going to want to spend most of your attention. From a course cap perspective, you're right on target with our average across the database. And in fact, your courses are, on average, better enrolled than our community colleges in the database. So this is something certainly to be encouraged by. Now, this is an average. We're going to unpack this data, and we're going to find some specific areas where you may want to consider refinement, but this is a good place to be at the start. Your specific Carnegie classification mean, I'll have to remind myself maybe at a break of what that Carnegie classification exactly is, but community college classification, again, right on target, the cap just under it. And then just for context, here's the minimum and the maximum in our database. The maximum's a four-year public in California, by the way. So there's certainly a lot to, I think, be encouraged by here. You're healthily enrolling your courses. Perhaps that's not a surprise for many of you. This is across the board. As we start to unpack this information and begin to think about how all of those metrics we talked about previously come into play, there is a bit of a story here. So the 19 over 24 gets you an 81% enrollment ratio. As I mentioned earlier, the target's 85% because of what that stands for in terms of balance. It puts you in the 82nd percentile. Higher's better, essentially. So you are certainly in the upper echelons of our database for community colleges in terms of average fill rates. Now, where you are potentially a bit challenged here is this idea of over-enrollment. As I mentioned, 95+% enrolled courses in your schedule. About a quarter of the schedule is filled to 95+%. My strong hunch is this comes at consequence to students who are trying to navigate a large portion of the schedule that's over-enrolled. Or 354 of 1,458 courses. You can see that puts you in the 11th percentile here in terms of our community college database. I'll say this, just to provide some context. We work with some community colleges in challenged rural areas in certain states where enrollment ratios on average can be 62%. 60%. So they're dealing with a different type of challenge. So this 24%, it definitely represents an opportunity for you. I don't want to be too alarmist, though, in putting you in the 11th percentile because of how challenged some of the community colleges we work with are. But I do want to underscore close to a quarter of your schedule being overloaded. And as you can see, our goal, and this is a goal for all clients, our goal is to get you all to a 10% overloaded course ratio. So to only have a 10th of your schedule in this overloaded state. It's a bit aspirational for many. But where we've seen institutions chip away at this over-enrollment, how can we push toward balance? And then, longitudinally speaking, how can we associate that to average student credit hours? Yes?
Hi. I just want to know, is that pulling together face-to-face classes and online? So it's a combination.
Yeah, it would. It would
And was
be.
there any way to separate out face-to-face versus online with this type of overloaded, balanced, underutilized?
So what you're able to do in the site, again, this goes back to how you break out campuses. And you can absolutely look at this information campus by campus. But if there's not a web-based, or if there's not a web campus, then we certainly just could kind of pull section data and look at this at that level.
Okay.
And that could be a follow-up, for
Okay.
sure.
Sure.
But it's
Thank
a
you.
little more challenging to disaggregate. Balanced course ratio. As you can see, our target is to get you to 60% of the schedule being balanced. 41% of the schedule, putting you in the 73rd percentile here, so almost, in that top quartile, fell in a balanced state. So 600 courses filled between 70 and 95% of their cap, or 41% of your schedule. And I think this is putting you in close to the the top quartile. Does represent, I think, another area to somewhat be commended for. At the same time, feel a bit of a challenge as you think about pushing toward that 60% balanced course ratio, especially because of the 24% overloaded course ratio. And then finally, 35% of your courses filled less than 70% of their cap. And that's just over our goal of 30%. And so if you think about balance in its most literal sense, the idea, especially perhaps at the discipline level, and I know this is going to be an overarching statement, and there's a lot of complexity underneath what I'm about to say, but the idea is where perhaps in certain core disciplines might we be able to consider underutilized courses coming at the same time as overloaded courses being offered term over term over term, and where might resources be able to shift to accommodate what has been a historical pattern of over-enrollment, right? Again, a pretty perhaps simplistic statement, but as you break this down, as we hope you would, right, this is an institutional data set. And you might start to get wide-eyed, and hopefully some of you are starting to think about your individual academic units, right? Because that's how this data, by the way, really becomes productively disseminated, is there is an institutional perspective on this. People understand via the framework and via the longitudinal data we're gathering the importance of this type of information as it relates to student success. And then ultimately, with that institutional framework in mind, academic units determine what is our area of priority here. How can we accommodate what is this sort of institutional push to build student success in the schedule? And really what that breaks down to, otherwise, look, there are 1,458 courses. Our advocacy would not be to dig into 1,458 courses, right? Especially out of the gate, if 600 of them are balanced, keep it up, right? Those are those ones you might be able to really kind of roll over. But as we look at candidates in just a second, the idea is to really kind of figure out what's the 6, 7, 8% of the schedule we can adjust in accordance with this type of data. And all of a sudden it becomes a little bit more feasible. And like I said at the outset, hopefully easier to think about scheduling, focusing on some of those core areas rather than trying to be overwhelmed by this whole 1,458 volume. Questions? And note, by the way, 35% of courses being underutilized puts you in the 86th percentile. The community college landscape is being challenged right now. It really is. It's a landscape that's often been, unfortunately, dictated by the economy. I think you all well know, right? As the economy improves, typically what happens is the fill rates at community colleges decline. We have clients who said, boy, 2009, we could offer anything and it would fill in 20 minutes. We were busting at the seams during the recession. But now, as the economy sort of improved, they're a little bit challenged. The hard part, and I don't mean to undermine what is a challenge conversation, is how do we become more fluid and flexible in all of this? And it's not easy. but the courses and sections you were offering in 2011 may not be as viable now because of the shifting landscape, right? But yet other courses in areas are. And so hopefully this type of perspective begins to shed some light on that. Okay, candidates. So, as I mentioned previously, where we get to the section level recommendation is how we start to get to candidates. And you can see 130 sections we offer or we suggest reducing, 133 we suggest removing, and 34 we suggest adding. I have all of that data. I can get it as a follow-up. It's a simple export from the dashboards that you have access to. Click on it, export it, pull them out, filter by your area, and then you can start to see, which of these are relevant to me. But again, 130 sections suggested for recommendation puts you in the 94th percentile. 133 sections recommended for elimination puts you in the 71st. And then these addition candidates. Now, these addition candidates should be understood for what they are, but also understood for their limitations. We're suggesting addition based solely on what's happened in the past. That's an imperfect marker for adding, right? If you've offered 100 seats in the past 3 like fall terms, and in 3 like fall terms all of those have filled, then based upon the fact that in the baseline it filled 100 seats, the trend it filled 100 seats, the analysis is going to recommend based on these integration points, offer 100 seats. The human eye will determine, wait a second, we've offered 4 sections of this in the past, it's repeatedly over-enrolled, maybe there's an opportunity to think about adding here. And that's where this potential addition comes into play, and I created a separate tab in a worksheet to highlight what amounted to close to, I think, 60 courses. Multi-section baseline enrollment ratios of 95+%. Those are more opportunities to think about adding beyond the 34 you see here. Yes?
We just added the functionality of waitlisting.
Yeah.
Is that data?
So it's not. Waitlisting is something we've talked about as an organization. The bottom line is it's utilized differently across the industry. And you just implemented it?
Yeah, we piloted it in the fall and we full implementation right now.
Sure. I can tell you that 2 things. One, when we get to the really predictive component of this and we're integrated with your degree audit system and your student pathways, that's our very objective means of aggregating demand. And we do so sooner than, so I was just this past week delivering several fall 2019 analyses for clients in the last 3 weeks. So they're planning right now, and we're giving them a sense of where they're offering 100 seats and they should offer 150. So that's where we get ahead of the wait list. That said, we have a ton of clients who utilize our data and also look at wait lists.
Combined together.
Totally. Yeah. Okay. Yes?
From your slide for the course offering exclusions,
Yeah.
you had listed some course numbers, and I noticed that 291 was not on there, which are our internship classes.
Got it.
So is there a way that we could communicate, there may be other departments that have that issue, that there may be courses that should be included?
Oh, absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
So the way our system works is that you have complete access to well, I shouldn't say that. There'll be a user or a small subset of users who have access to these exclusions, and all of our clients work with that institutionally. Yeah, so just, hey, I noticed this course in here. Here's why it's should be excluded. Can we remove it? Done. And there are 2 types. So we always recommend exclude post-analysis, meaning don't exclude entirely from the analysis because we've got to associate students to those internships. We just don't want the internships to show up, if that makes sense, right? Because otherwise, we would bypass the student in the internship and instead give them demand elsewhere, and that doesn't work. So we want to give them demand, just not show the course itself. Maybe I got too deep there. That's fine. Don't worry about it. Work with exclusions. It'll be good. Any other questions? Any reactions to this? Folks surprised, not surprised, alarmed? Yes.
I was just curious, for the underutilized course ratios, does that include, does it take into account the cross-listed courses? So we have several in social sciences that have 3 or 4 cross-listings, so some of those may only have 4 or 5 students in them, but for the overall, it's one course, and that course fills. So does that underutilized ratio take that into account, or are they counting those as separate courses?
Great question. Again, this goes back to the extent to which cross-lists are picked up in Banner is the extent to which we pick them up. And we'll associate a course-listed course across the board, right, where it's cross-listed, so that we do account for the 2 or 3 courses contributing to a full kind of demand picture, if that makes sense. But that said, cross-lists are tricky, and they're subject to further coordination and timing, and when do you cross-list, and well, we ran the analysis in February, but the cross-list was made in April, and so therefore it's showing up. So there are lots of questions, and we'll want to continue to coordinate on that, but ultimately, yes, our analysis is designed to pick up cross-lists. Now, that said, when you look at 35% underutilized courses, you have access to all the data. Take a look at it. Am I going to promise you that we captured all those cross-listed courses? We may not have, right? We may have, and that's exactly why we want to continue to have these conversations and to get eyeballs on this data so that we can configure it more and more appropriately as we move forward.
So if a quarter of our courses are online and we fill up each section before we open up another section, then isn't the data that includes face-to-face and online kind of off?
Can you ask that question again? Sorry.
So that includes face-to-face and online courses.
Sure.
But a quarter of our courses are online,
Yeah.
and in online courses, we fill the sections, then we open up a new one. We fill the sections, we open up a new one. So if online are included there, doesn't it kind of ruin the data? Because it's very different than our face-to-face sections.
Yeah, I mean, ruin the data is an interesting way to put it. I think, yeah, no, I think it highlights something. I think that, and when we take into account some of the capacity information, it might be interesting to think about those online offerings and why those online offerings fill the way that they do. But, ultimately, what's that? The online and on-ground? Yeah. So again, can we? Sure. Yeah, I mean, very simply, we could. It would require a separate kind of spreadsheet dive just because of the way that our analysis works. We work with the imports from your Banner system. If your Banner system doesn't account for a web campus or a specific web course in a way that our imports pick it up, it's difficult to disaggregate.
But online might have 100% overloaded, a quarter of our courses.
Well, so let me ask you this. So the better question is, if online courses are overloaded, I'll take you for what you said, that you offer a section online, the online section fills, and you offer another one and the online section fills. Ultimately, you're still trying, whether the course be online or on ground, to accommodate the demand so that students can complete a requirement on time, right? So the question is, if I offer 6 sections, if they fill on ground to 95+%, okay. If they fill on the web, 95+%, okay. The question is, ultimately, should I have offered 7 or 8? Whether or not they're online or on ground is perhaps almost irrelevant to that conversation. The question is, did I offer enough seats to accommodate the demand so that students can get access to the course?
But then this data is not telling us, do we take it away online or add online? Do we take away face-to-face or add on face? It's not.
Patrick, could we just let Jen?
Yeah.
Oh, I completely understand what you're saying, but in reality, not every online course is at capacity. Quite a number of them are not, but still, it would be more meaningful to see the data separated out. And we're currently having a discussion about how to list online enrollments in our campus code system, because with the closure of community campus, we don't any longer have that designation. So this is helpful to think about in the context of that other discussion.
Yes, I agree, because Ad Astra can only deal with the information we send them. So if we don't have it coded in a way that we can pull that information out in Banner, that's something that as an institution we need to go back and look at. And some of those things are bubbling up right now, how we're coding things, the overlap, duplication, the misunderstanding, or the mislabeling of things. So this is really to begin that conversation, because we all need to be at the table to talk about what makes sense for PIMA, and how we do things, and what makes sense for our students when they're enrolling for these different courses.
Awesome.
My comment was on the underutilized, and then I saw the Math 89 numbers flash up top. I'm from West Campus Math. In the fall, that was the start of the phase out for Math 89. By now, we're like maybe 25% of the classes still being offered. By summer, it's done. So fall data for the 89 was part of our phase out of those classes.
So that was removed. We didn't include 89. Yep, those were exclusions. So we excluded the course. Yep, absolutely. So noted. We can definitely take a look at the online courses. I think the extent to which we continually provide in a visual way a breakout of online versus on-ground courses is subject to the integration, but we can certainly get that in the short term. Yes, sir.
My question is kind of based off of some information that I kind of picked up over the course of the this talk. It sounds like this is something you made mention that you'll sort of the data can get updated and things like that. So it seems like this is somewhat dynamic. So I'm envisioning the use of this being by deans or department heads or course schedules or things like that, logging in and looking at this data. And I guess my question in terms of usability, especially since we rotate department heads, or a new dean might come in, or someone with fresh eyes that doesn't know all of the context that you keep referring to, like when data meets context, that's very important. And so how is there a way for this interface or whatever, however it looks, to be customizable for PIMA's needs, so we can sort of go in and sort of add a column or add a row or add in some additional information to provide that information, so we don't have to rehash these conversations every single time we see a 24% show up. It's like, well, we've hashed out that conversation in this big long meeting where we sort of understand why that 24% is. We sort of understand what portion of that lays with online. So like, is there a way that we can sort of customize this, and sort of merge the context with the data so that we don't have to rehash these conversations every time like a new department head comes along or something like that?
Yeah. I can tell you that right now we are in the process of updating our entire software infrastructure to account for flexibility and tailoring in the ways that you're describing. Now, I can't quite say yet the extent to which we'd be able to account for everything that you're describing, but I think you'll find even in the next 6 to 8 months that our software platform is even more flexible. Ultimately, what we want each institution to do is to really own this information, right? And to work certainly with Ad Astra personnel in getting this off the ground and making sure that we have a firm understanding of things. But then ultimately, as we flash forward 12, 18 months, there is like the exclusion conversation certainly comes to play here. There are sort of core departments on campus or a department on campus who really owns this. And the institution knows, I can go here to gather resources for this. Or should there be updates to this, I'm going to go here so that we can see that reflected in the data. And within that, there's training, right? As new department chairs come in or new potential end users come in, you want to have them get up to speed with this type of a platform if it's going to be core to your scheduling process. And so with that, we need to have folks who kind of own this process and own this operation on campus with the help, of course. Let me say, full support from Ad Astra and whatever that entails. But I can't come every 6 months, nor would you want me to, and have this sort of conversation over and over again. but rather, as folks become aware of the application, the implications of the data, you kind of own it slowly but surely in ways that I think ultimately you're describing. That makes sense. And then ultimately, too, the software will hopefully, in our newer infrastructure, create more and more flexibility in order for you to even inject some of this to tailor it along the way. Does that make sense? Further questions? This is great. Very, very good conversation. I appreciate all of these questions. They're giving me some ideas about how I'm going to take some of this data back. Okay. So let's jump to the capacity side. The capacity analysis here, so you're also, as Lamada had said at the outset, Ad Astra has been part of the conversation now for several months because not only are you implementing Platinum Analytics, but you are also implementing what's called Astra Schedule. And that is think of it as your space management tool. Now the two should not be thought of completely independently. And in fact, our developers are trying to merge our software more and more together such that they're not independent conversations. Because if you start to think about, well, why isn't this section filling, or how do I get more sections, capacity certainly comes into play almost immediately. And so we will, alongside this Astra Schedule implementation and Platinum Analytics, be able to see data from both directions to create a holistic conversation. This capacity analysis for fall 2018 is some initial insight into some high-level capacity considerations that absolutely will need to be unpacked, but hopefully you can start to see some of the correlating factors between what we just shared from a course perspective and what we'll see here from a capacity side, because the two are certainly interrelated in a strategic scheduling approach. So there are kind of core areas three core areas we're going to talk through, the first of which is what we call prime time. I think Lamada referred to it as the hot spot. And so it can be thought of certainly the same way. So prime time is basically the subset of your on-ground scheduling week where we note the highest volume of activity, right? So this is, by the way, any capacity analysis, of course, we're not going to include any web information here at all. This is all just on ground. So what we picked up on Monday through Thursday, well, your standard week, by the way, is Monday through Thursday. We didn't pick up on enough Friday activity to suggest any sort of standard scheduling taking place. And so Monday through Thursday, 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., or 44 total hours, represents your standard week. Within that standard week, there is a subset called prime time, which is essentially 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Monday through Thursday. So we note, and every institution has a relative prime time, we note that the highest volumes of activity take place between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. I can tell you, and the dashboards will show this, that is 8 hours below. The prime time total volume of 16 hours is 8 hours below. I believe it's 8, might be 6. We can double check. The community college average we see, which means that we see a higher volume of activity in a more condensed volume or more condensed window of time on your campus than we see relative to your peers. You have almost 2/3 the prime time window of your peers. And that can be problematic, if that makes sense. So we talk about web-based proliferation, course proliferation, and look, I wouldn't associate the two entirely to say this is the situation taking place. However, we certainly have seen with other clients a correlating relationship between a condensed prime time and an increased web-based course proliferation, right? So basically, if you're thinking as a student, I want to get, call it 15 credit hours, but the majority of the schedule is being placed between 10 a.m., or the highest volume of the schedule is being placed between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., not only does that give me a finite amount of time with which to work, but also it increases the likelihood that a conflict will arise in courses that I need. If I need a chemistry course and I need a biology course, both of which run from 10:30 to 11:45 Tuesday and Thursday, I'm fresh out of luck, right? I simply can't take both. And so this just increases this increases the challenge for students, bottom line. And we can continue to unpack the reasons why. But one kind of stark thought I had as I looked through this data was relative to your peers, this might be a real area of consideration as you think about on-ground scheduling. Thoughts, comments, disagreement about what I'm sharing here? Yes, ma'am. Oh, sorry.
Do you know the percentage of enrollments that fall within the prime time?
It's a great question. I can pull that. That's not data that we extract immediately for purposes of this presentation, but we certainly, all of these questions, getting to web-based courses, getting to this, it leads me to just work with a section export and kind of slice and dice, and I think that could be a good follow-up for sure. So what are you getting at with that question? Just curious. Yeah, absolutely, right? So the idea being what percentage of on-ground enrollment takes place between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m.? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to do you have correlational data to look at whether they're full-time or part-time students? We have an extraordinarily high number of part-time students. Something we're working on.
Right. So that, too, is a bit of a layered question. They declared part-time or full-time and something we can extract from Banner?
No. We have to pull it through their enrollment.
So I can tell you as an organization, we want to note that students are part-time and we want to tailor to part-time students, but we don't want to justify scheduling necessarily solely around part-time students. And the reason is because in a perfect world, we can push part-time students to full-time students, right? There is so much data to suggest your likelihood of graduating as a full-time student is sincerely increased when compared to a part-time student. And so to that end, the better question for us is to unpack, are the majority of your students part-time by choice, or are they part-time because of just the mere fact that we noted they took 6 credit hours the previous term?
So my interest was more, when are they taking the classes, right? Are the part-times the ones in this time frame, or are they evening students, right? Because that alters our scheduling tailoring based upon when we see those patterns of enrollment happening.
I think what we need to do is we need to coordinate with, if it be your IR office, if there's some way for us to gather who are the part-time, who are the full-time. But then we also don't, it's going to be tough. Yeah, because we don't pick up on who registered. We will ultimately pick up on individual students when we associate them with pathways, but even then, we just don't pick up on who registered in which section. Okay. We just don't. Sorry. But it is a good thing to consider. You know, if a huge volume of our student population is part-time, why are they part-time? Is that a conversation worth exploring? And might we help influence that? Yes?
What I was going to say is, what percentage, I think it's interesting that this is the prime time. I kind of wanted to know, what the second runner-up prime time is. And, if this is, 74% face-to-face prime time, what's the next best thing? If this is happening at every single campus, is there a way to say, okay, prime time at West is, 5 to 8? Can more face-to-face students sort of great, I do prime time at downtown, and then I do prime time at West. You know what I'm saying? Is there a way to just understand, I guess, how to utilize the campuses more?
Sure.
During prime time, what's the capacity for classrooms? Is it at a 74% capacity? Or is there 25% more classrooms? And I know that that's a PIMA thing as well. How does prime time compare to what's still available as far as classrooms?
Sure.
Just an interesting concept with prime time, and could you maximize it in a different way at different campuses, I guess?
Yeah, and we actually unpack your classroom utilization during prime time versus not. so that we can start to get at some of those questions, but I love where your head's going. And honestly, as we think about, that next runner-up or, first of all, we have a report that we work with. In fact, I don't know if Ivy and Lamada, you remember seeing kind of a line graph report to suggest what we look at is where's classroom activity relative to the time during the week. And we just have a line graph, and it spikes between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And then, yes, there is a drop-off. Now, how significant is that drop-off? It's a determination made in conjunction with some of the project leads at the outset of this. So it's not this exact scientific, well, here is 80% plus. It's just, and I can give you the report. I can send over the report. You can take a look yourself. But I will say this, when we talk about kind of that next runner-up or how you consider other prime times, it's not in most cases a situation of, okay, how do we open up an evening prime time? It's more, how do we just spread the parameters of our current prime time, right? If we're noting classroom activity spiking between 10 and 2, what if we spread things out so that it doesn't spike between 10 and 2, but there's a smoother increase between 9 and 3, right? So we reduce those conflicts, we provide students more on-ground opportunities, and it's not necessarily jumping to 6 to 8, but rather spreading out the existing prime time. Yes, ma'am.
Just to clarify, a previous slide said this is West Campus classrooms. So
that's a great.
This prime time only West Campus?
Yeah,
it's not like the whole college.
Yes, that's a really.
So we could actually do that for like each campus and see what the prime time is for each campus.
Yeah, it is West Campus that
Thank
we
you.
use the
Thank
largest
you.
campus to do this sample data. But I will tell you from the work that Brian and I did with the scheduling work group throughout the college, it was 10 to 2 because you were all doing your schedules in silos. It was each campus focusing on that campus's needs. And then when we moved to the college-wide, where we're sharing more resources, and some classrooms are going offline because of renovation, then that's when we ran into problems of, oh dear, we're used to using the 10 to 2. We want to now offer a class at another campus that is also using a room we would normally use for pedagogical reasons, but they also have that room tied up at 10 to 2. So surprisingly, that pattern was throughout the college.
And just to be clear, and thank you very much for saying that, all of the remaining capacity data will be specific to West Campus. In our dashboards, you can, I don't want to commit to that. I want to double check. I believe in the dashboards you can switch to different campuses, but yeah, perfect. Perfect.
Are there other attributes that we can dissect the data through? Like if we're looking at something as a hybrid designated course, we have a bunch of attributes in our banner system. So to help us slice and dice the data from what you've been able to give us.
Yeah, within the parameters within the dashboards, we can take a look at those, are going to be a little bit more limited. Again, I go back to the question previously where our new infrastructure is allowing us hopefully to be able to slice and dice even further. Where I do a lot of the underlying work at the request of clients is looking at section files, and we've got some folks who are very adept at doing this because we've done it for some time, so we can do it fairly quickly. Given work that we're doing with the strategic scheduling team, should these questions arise, we can absolutely inform those conversations. Yeah, but it is always going to be at the within the parameters of what we import, which is important. Yeah. Okay, so continuing on this West Campus exploration here. First of all, what we wanted to do, as I mentioned previously, is take a note of how you're utilizing your classrooms, meaning the extent to which classrooms are being utilized versus to the extent they could be fully utilized, which is a function of a few different things, namely off-grid scheduling, which we'll talk about in just a second. And so you can see across that standard 44-hour work or scheduling week that we noted, you're utilizing your classrooms to 45% of their potential capacity which puts you in the 81st percentile, actually. And then your prime time utilization puts you, it's the 72nd percentile here. You're utilizing your classrooms to 69% of their potential capacity in prime time, which can speak to a few different things if you slice and dice it a couple different ways. Firstly, you're speaking to that drop-off, right, between inside and outside of prime time. It doesn't seem, given the fact that you're in the 81st percentile, as severe as we've seen in other campuses, given the fact that you are utilizing your standard week to 45% of its capacity, right? So there definitely is some utilization outside of 10 to 2 relative to your peers to suggest it's not necessarily as condensed, but it certainly is, given its time frame, a pretty consequential window here. And the fact that you're only utilizing classrooms to 70% of their capacity during this prime window is something else, given the fact that it's in the 72nd percentile, to consider as well. If 10 to 2, or ultimately, as we would advocate, 9 to 2, 9 to 3 becomes the prime time, how are we maximizing utilization of that space so as to best accommodate students during this period, right? And that is, we'll talk about off-grid scheduling, a function of making sure sections are aligned, right, so that there's no white space in between one section and another. But then also, it's a question of room cap and course cap alignment, right? So the extent to which you're utilizing the fullest extent of that room. And then finally, and something to be blunt, we just don't measure, I think, as well as we could, is what are you offering in prime time? I mentioned previously, if you've got 35% of your courses that are underutilized, let's say a healthy percentage of those are on ground, what percentage of those courses are taking core time and resources during that prime time hour, right? We've had some clients that have said, if you want to schedule a section during prime time, historically speaking, it needs to have filled, especially if we're working 10 to 2, it needs to have filled, between 70 and 100% of its cap, right? So that we can maximize utilization of our space because of that student availability factor, and we know how consequential this window is. Those policies typically come over time, but that is something we've seen. Question in the back? No. I had another thought, and I forgot it. It's all right. Hopefully it'll come back to me. And then primetime compression. Primetime compression basically looks at the statistical likelihood of you scheduling during prime time versus not. If it were evenly spread out, the compression goal would be 30%. But right now, you all are at 55% more likely to schedule in that 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. period than not. And given the fact that it's a 4-hour window each day, it speaks to the high volume of activity in that space. And there have been some it's interesting. I think I just remembered my thought. There have been some questions around the student component in this, part-time versus full-time. When are they available? And a question that we typically ask our clients is, how often do you survey your students? How do you know? So is prime time, if I may ask a blunt question, is prime time the product of faculty decisions over time? Or is prime time the factor of when students say they're available? Probably a little bit of both, but if we were to sort of disaggregate that and try to figure things out, we've had a lot of clients design surveys. Maybe a student's registered, take 5 minutes, fill out this survey. When are you available for courses? Did you get everything that you needed in the last term? Would you prefer an on-ground course versus a web-based course? We can start to design some of these questions so that you can get that student perspective. And in doing so, really kind of use that to influence some of the decisions you see here. Has there been any work to survey students in the past here at Pima? Anybody know? Seeing a nod? Yes, sir.
From my little niche perspective, our course offerings have done that. The middle of the day sections fill, the other times less so. Mm-hmm. So prime time is just driven by demand. kind of figure that out and put classes where they belong.
Mm-hmm. Sure. That's good. Yeah, we can certainly do an analysis on that. By the way, have you all seen, by chance, there's been any work done to note the success in an online course versus an on-ground course? Are success rates roughly the same, online versus on-ground? 7% difference.
Sorry. 7%. Yeah, with online falling below the
Sure.
success in
Yep,
face-to-face
yep.
by 7.
Good.
Can we further unpack that data to, for example, nursing has very set criteria and curriculum.
Yeah.
And that's a massive population at West Campus. Dental hygiene, my dental programs, they're massive populations. And art has certain requirements as well. All of those, because they're so concentrated, can skew data.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting if we could pull that out and look at gen eds and see whether or not this is happening in gen eds and to what degree,
Yeah.
because that's going to target a broader population.
Yeah, no, that's a really great, I've actually done that very analysis for clients because they had noted, again, this web-based proliferation, and something like 90% of their on-ground gen ed sections were between, it was like 9 and 2 or something like that. So yeah, and what did I do to get there? I did an in-depth section analysis. So I think what we need to do is collect a lot of the questions and ways in which you like to unpack this data and see if we can do some swift analyses to help inform those questions. Any other thoughts, questions? There is a few other kind of capacity angles we wanted to take. The second I already alluded to was this notion of room capacity, enrollment cap, and enrollment. And what we are looking at here basically is the relationship between how courses are scheduled relative to the room that they're in via a room cap, course cap alignment, again on the West Campus. And then ultimately how courses are filling in that course offered in that room. Interestingly, your enrollment ratio on ground on the West Campus is higher than the overall enrollment ratio. So before we jump too quickly, it's interesting to note that there was the conversation around web-based courses filling relatively high. This might suggest that there is, in fact, a higher enrollment ratio, at least on one of your campuses, than the overall enrollment ratio. And so that's perhaps worth unpacking further. But what you can see here first is the fact that the seat fill enrollment ratio, meaning that you fill your courses in rooms offered on campus to 73% of their cap, 23 enrollment against a room cap of 31. I think the opportunity here suggests that if a quarter of the courses are overloaded, once we unpack for web courses, on ground courses, to what extent are overloaded courses capped at 20, call it 6, where pedagogically they could offer 30 sections, or 30 seats, sorry, 30 seats, but due to room constraints, they can only offer 26, right? And where are there conversely situations where a room or a course is capped at 45, right? Because this is an average. A room is capped at 45. Historical enrollment suggests they may only need a room size of 30, and as a consequence of that misalignment, a course that would otherwise have been able to accommodate more students is forced, due to the room they're in, to cut down that enrollment cap, right? So essentially there's capacity to suggest an ability to accommodate more demand on average, and given the fact that there are 25% overloaded courses, it's something to explore. Pedagogy should, of course, still first drive things, but. Questions on that? Have there been any sort of conversations around how are rooms allocated here on campus? Are they allocated strictly centrally? No. There's some seat shifting going on. Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Every campus is different. You're saying at West, right? This is West.
Yeah, this is West.
West, there are divisions that oversee certain courses.
Sure.
And then there's a general overall scheduling for the rest of the space. So it will depend upon which division you're talking about.
Sure, absolutely. And Ivy, have you had conversations around the optimizer in Astra schedule at all? No optimizer, yeah. On the optimizer, yep. Yeah, very good. So there is within Astra schedule, there is a functionality to essentially optimize room allocation to course caps, and you can set up different parameters, and ultimately the idea being that we're seeking to optimize space in accordance with room caps and course caps, obviously, again, underscoring the need for those course caps to be kind of foundationally sound. But if we can optimize that, there's a way in which you might better address the demand that you see on ground, which certainly does exist. Yes, sir?
Can you put in parameters such as it's a computer classroom?
Totally,
Okay,
absolutely.
that would be, yeah.
Yeah, there are so many parameters. You could probably attest. There are many different ways that you can set this up. So yeah. Okay, final sort of angle to all of this on a capacity side is off-grid scheduling. So off-grid scheduling, well, let's talk about on-grid scheduling, I guess. So the importance of on-grid scheduling, think of what you're seeing here as sort of a Tetris game, right? So the idea being to section in your courses such that you minimize white space, right? And have a certain grid that folks adhere to. And so what you can see in the top left corner, it's funny, we call it typical. I think it's a bit of a unicorn because we've never seen that perfect on-grid scheduling. Well, it got a lot colder in here, didn't it? Folks are reaching for their coat. I think it feels great. I was kind of burning up a little bit. But the 9 to 9:50, 10 to 10:50, 11 to 11:50, Monday, Wednesday, maybe Friday, and then certainly the 9 to 10:15, 10:30 to 11:45. That would represent your kind of on-grid pattern, right? But what we typically find are situations where folks fall off-grid. Instead of going 9 to 9:50, you schedule 9:30 to 10:20. And not only do the different blocks that you see highlighted here create inefficient capacity, which speaks to ways in which it costs the institution, but I think more fundamentally, it creates conflicts for students, right? As we talk about that 10 to 2 block, how important it is for students to really have limited conflicts in order to accommodate their schedules. Because if I'm scheduling 9:30 to 10:20, and I'm offering an English course, but a student needs English and history, and that history is 9 to 9:50 or 10 to 10:50, clearly they can't take both at that point in time, right? So there are, and Lamada has said that you've done a lot of work to address some of this in recent terms, and in fact, the data suggests there's been a pretty steep decline in off-grid scheduling and waste, which is really positive to note. But are there any questions about on-grid, off-grid scheduling? So, given the improvements seen, we still note that off-grid usage, so 43% of what is scheduled off-grid. And by the way, each institution has its own relative grid. And I think, I'll tell you what, we could have done a better job of highlighting what your grid is. It's in the dashboards. Each institution has their own relative grid. We run a report to suggest what are the most common, non-overlapping 3 credit hour periods, and that's your grid. We don't have a grid at Ad Astra that we try to project onto you. And against your relative grid, 43% was scheduled off-grid, which constituted 13% waste. Our goal is to reduce that off-grid utilization and actually get waste down to 5%. Again, all of this relative to what we've noted corresponds to increased student course access in any given term. So, ultimately, and we have, and in fact, we've got about 10 minutes. Maybe, I don't know if you want to go into the dashboards. Is that right? Or are we supposed to go to 10:30, right, with this group? Perfect. So in the dashboards, we can show you sort of where that waste exists, how you can export it. And ultimately, that sort of conversation is a highly collaborative one, right, as you try to seek out the reasons behind some of the scheduling decisions made and determine what's feasible, what's not. So at this point, having addressed all of kind of the high-level areas, my thought, and in fact, is my jump drive? You did give it back to me. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Perfect, because I've got your site loaded on here. I just plug it in right here? Perfect. Look at that. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to log into your site and give you a sense of what data is available. This site, by the way, I'm going to pass along to Ivy and Lamada, and we can talk through kind of access and how you get into the site, things of that nature. We always, I say that, I went into Chrome, right? We always recommend using Chrome. It's the best server for this site, and it's not a site that you remember. It's one that you definitely want to bookmark. So that's what I encourage. Perfect. So as this is loading, we shared a lot of data. And the data, so you can see here, scheduling dashboard, scheduling index. When we run kind of that first full analysis, you'll see even platinum dashboards populate here. So you log in, you can see across the top, you've got dashboards, analytics. Those are the two tabs that you're going to be most concerned with. And I logged into the dashboards tab, and that's just loading here now. But as it's loading, and what you'll see is a visual representation of everything we just looked at. But it's a lot of data, and it's a lot to unpack, it's a lot to digest. And really what it's about, I don't think necessarily this represented 10 different directions we believe you should move headlong in. Rather, again, through the work of this strategic team, in alignment with your vision and goals, we want to establish what are your immediate priorities and how do we establish a real kind of feasible path forward with this. We're not going to address all of this overnight, and some of this might even be worth addressing faster than others. But it's through conversation, you understanding this data more and more, where we determine what's going to be the best path forward. So, course access on the left-hand side, resource efficiency on the right-hand side are two kind of general buckets that we want to categorize the first six metrics into. And interestingly here, all of these we talked about within the site or within the presentation. Off-grid waste, as I mentioned, Lamada, even before I think seeing these trend lines, had said, look, we've done a lot of work with our off-grid scheduling. It was something we knew we needed to address. And take a look at the way off-grid waste has gone down pretty measurably between fall of 2017, where you were at 23%, down to 13% waste. So that's a pretty significant drop. As I mentioned, especially on the course side, we look back 5 like terms. So you see these trend lines on both the course and capacity piece, where we go back to, in 5 like terms, what would amount to fall of 2014. And you can see the metrics, and they're highlighted in red in areas where, due to either them being over the goal or under the goal, there are areas of potential improvement here. So there's a good amount of red, so a good amount of opportunity here. But again, it's about sort of understanding what's feasible here. So you can see there are 2 tabs when you get into the HESI dashboards, the first of which is top indices, which we categorize into course access and resource efficiency. So course access, if you understand the interrelationship of off-grid waste, the overloaded course ratio, and addition candidates, all of them directly, according to our CEO who kind of designed this framework, directly coincide with course access. Right? So the idea being, if we address these 3 top indices here, we'll be doing so with course access in mind. Whereas enrollment ratio, classroom utilization during the standard week, and seat fill utilization enrollment speaks a lot more to resource efficiency. I go to all indices. I think there are 17 metrics. A lot of data. And within the data, there are various ways you can filter. So that's going to populate here real quickly. Real quickly. Here it comes. It should come in a second. There it is. So these are all of your indices. A lot of data to load, I guess, huh? And again, all of this we talked about, all of this we note. If I dig into that enrollment ratio, you can start to see. So by the way, all of these, if you hover over the name, you should see the definition of each of these metrics. There was a lot of data potentially and a lot discussed. So understanding each of those metrics, I think, will be kind of core to your exploration of all of this. And so if I get into, I won't go, given the fact we've got 5 minutes here, I won't go into each of these, rest assured. But if I go into the enrollment ratio, click details here, what you'll see are kind of what drove this. How did we get to the numbers that we did? So the enrollment ratio of 81%, as we talked about, an average enrollment of 19 over a cap of 24. And you can start to see along the left-hand side all of the various ways that you can slice and dice this information. You know, you've got your various campuses here, which we defaulted to include all of them. However, you know, you could just sort of pivot to a single campus if you would like, which could be really kind of helpful. Now, we talked about the fact that 81% enrollment ratio is clearly an average, right? And so within that, you're going to have specific areas that might be more critically bottlenecked than others. And as you can see here, the first, I think this amounts to 8 subject areas, all of which enrolled to 94% on average, 90% when we get to 24 subject areas, 87% at 36. So there are critical bottleneck areas, I would imagine, in all of these situations. Now, do you also perhaps have cohort situations that are mingled in here? Absolutely, right? So it's a matter of taking the data in its context together. But over time, and I want you to think about the fact that Platinum Analytics, the data that you'll be receiving moving forward, is going to overlay this historical perspective with the perspective driven by degree audit integration, pathway integration, so that we can really note the impact of some of this likely pent-up demand. Enrollment cap by subject. And here, by the way, I was talking previously, and I can make this a little bit bigger, I was talking previously about this idea of taking balance, say, taking some of these metrics and driving them down to the academic unit level. Well, this graph could be a good way to start to drive that conversation. Essentially what we're looking at in this baseline term enrollment ratio series graph is a breakdown of overloaded, balanced, and underutilized courses by discipline, right? And so to this end, you may be able to account for how could we, and not to, I have zero agenda, of course, but how could we account for 21% overloaded courses and 36% underutilized courses in the same discipline? From a resource perspective, it starts to become a little more feasible, I would imagine, to have those conversations at this level than it would, say, institutionally. But institutionally, we're trying to build balance. How do we break this down and start to take action in our own individual academic units? So this could be a way to drive that conversation. And then ultimately, what clearly this comes down to is a question of courses themselves. Where are we seeing actual courses for which we note addition, potential addition, reduction, elimination opportunities? You take this data, this down arrow here, and then we have a PowerPoint kind of tutorial guide that walks you through how to get in and out of this data. So I'll send that along as a follow-up. But down here, I click this, send to Excel, and it exports immediately to Excel, at which time you can pull it, and it then is obviously very filterable and all of that. And speaking of, I took the liberty, and I'll send this as a follow-up, of just looking at these candidate types out of the gate. Now, when you do export, it's a raw export. You got to, for those of you familiar with Excel, you set up filters, you filter accordingly. But I took the liberty of taking a look at the candidate types here that might be worth exploring. So you've got your top edition, your potential edition candidates, and sorry, I scrolled all the way to the bottom. And I mentioned these potential edition. There's a limitation to historical data. You offered 100 seats, you filled 100 seats, you've done it 3 terms, looking forward, offer 100 seats again, is what the analysis will tell you. But interestingly, with the slight human eye, you can detect very quickly how many 3+ section courses are filling to 95+% of their cap. And the answer is close to 60. So taking these to what we call top edition, these are situations where the analysis actually notes demand above supply heading the fall 19 and these potential considerations. There's a lot to consider when you think about opening up course access. And to the question previously brought up, you know, web-based, is web-based included in this? If it's rolled up to the West Campus, then yes it is. So you offer 4 sections, and all 4 sections, 2 offered on ground, 2 offered online, all filled to 100% of their cap. The question is, at that course level, do we need a 5th? Do we need a 6th? Because clearly the demand is there, right? So, you know, you work left to right. The top reduction candidates here give you, sorry, it keeps scrolling down on me, gives you some considerations for where to add, where to reduce. So you're offering multiple sections. In fall 2018, the enrollment ratio was less than 70%. How much you reduce? The elimination in the next tab is your single section courses. And then I actually also pulled out the final tab. Single section overruled. Single section courses filling less than 50%. The software, given the fact it doesn't check every single box, just kind of glosses over them and says no action. But again, kind of like the potential additions, you may want to do this a second. We're at 10:30. Really, really great conversation. I can tell out of the gate this is going to be an awesome collaborative partnership. So thank you all so much for your time. We're going to get you access to this information, follow up with Ron and I, which hopefully we can disseminate out. Lots of fun. So hopefully this is just the start of some productive conversation. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Patrick, and I want to thank Ivy for working so closely with Ad Astra so that Patrick could come in and do this presentation for us. There's a lot of information to digest. It will be an ongoing conversation, and I think it'll be worth our while to look at this last piece of information that Patrick shared with us so that we can see the suggested additions and reductions and possible elimination. Now, when Ad Astra is fully implemented, because we're working with scheduling first, we need to clean up how we do our scheduling so that we all play nicely in the sandbox with limited resources. Then Ad Astra will start helping us also with the guided pathways. We have guided pathways on paper, but we cannot possibly do all that needs to be done to make guided pathways fully implemented and effective on paper. Ad Astra will help us with that. But I think in the meantime, we need to keep having these conversations. This should bubble from the ranks of those of you in the trenches with your students who know what their needs are, to the department heads and to the deans, ongoing conversation with everybody in your department at the table and everybody in the division at the table. So I'm going to put the burden on the deans again to make sure that this conversation happens and that you're building the schedule together. I'm a former faculty member, and I have to admit that if you asked me to teach outside of 8:30 to 11:30, my office hours at 12, and I can go home by 1:30, you are going to have a fight. Because at that time, unlike you, I was not thinking of students. I was thinking of my own convenience. And I've seen so many of you that will stretch yourself throughout the entire day to meet students' needs. My job as a leader is to make sure that you take care of your health so that you can meet students' needs. So we need to have these conversations about how we can do this more efficiently without you going home at night absolutely exhausted because you stretched yourself every which way in order to make this work. Thank you so much for your time. Let's continue the conversation. You know how to reach me. My door is open. If you have any questions, you need anything that I forgot to supply, don't be afraid to pop in or reach out. And begin to have these conversations with your colleagues. This is a collaborative project. It is not going to be Lamata said, so don't you go out here and say Lamata said. Lamata is suggesting. All right, thank you, Patrick.